AITA for breaking my fiancé's family tradition by naming my son what I wanted. I am not the original poster. That is you, throwaway baby name. She posted in r, am I the asshole? Trigger warning. Brief mention of murder at the very end. Less than. Mood spoiler. Baby is not named Peter. Less than. Original post. April 16, 2023. Throwaway because I have in-laws on Reddit. Myself. 25F. And my fiancé. 27M. Have a 2-month-old son. We are overjoyed at being parents. But most of my in-laws are refusing to even see our baby because of a decision we made concerning his name. My in-laws have a tradition of giving the firstborn son of every generation the same name. Let's say it's Peter. This has been going on for about 7 generations already. And they're very serious about it. My fiancé's eldest cousin was the latest person to get named Peter. Every one of his cousins has only had daughters so far. So our baby is the first son of his generation, and consequently should get the name. I have no problem with the name Peter, and would have been okay with naming my son that. Unfortunately, that was also the name of my uncle, who died before I was born. I won't get into details, but it was tragic and traumatizing for my family. My father never got over losing his younger brother. My grandmother asked the family not to name any of our future children Peter during her lifetime. My Mill and Phil knew about this promise, and at first seemed to not only be okay with us avoiding the name Peter, but also supportive of the one we chose. However, my grandmother sadly passed away when I was 7 months pregnant. We traveled for her funeral. On our last days there, my in-laws called to offer me their condolences. Then my Mill asked me if I was willing to think about the name Peter now. Suddenly, they were insistent that the name we chose was awful and we had to honor their tradition. According to them, they had only agreed to make an exception for us for my grandmother's sake, and had no obligation to keep it now that she had passed. My family agrees that while it's true we don't have to avoid the name anymore, it still doesn't feel right to use it. My fiancé agrees with me as well, but his parents spent the last weeks of my pregnancy trying to convince us to change our minds about the name. When our baby was born and we named him what we wanted, my in-laws were furious that we had broken a 7-generation-old family tradition. Some of them hadn't previously wanted to name their sons Peter, but did it anyway for the family's sake. They said our decision was selfish, and that my family should have moved on by now. This has truly nothing to do with whether my family has moved on or not. It just felt like a betrayal to my grandmother and uncle's memories to even consider using the name. My Phil offered us $1,000 to change our son's name to Peter after he was born. That was 2 months ago, and neither of my fiancé's parents have met the baby or seen us since I was pregnant. Most of my in-laws are on their side, and this is causing a huge rift between my fiancé and his family. He assures me he's fine, but I'm starting to feel really guilty about this. AITA? Edit. The tradition started, as far as I know, when Og Peter died and his son, also named Peter, named his firstborn after his father. Peter III ended up having the first son of the following generation, and did the same thing. That one died before having children, so his sister gave the name to her son, and so on. The name Peter is very common in my country, so none of them ever got bullied over it, and the fact that it was also my uncle's name isn't as unlikely as one might think. Also, middle names aren't used in my country. Most people get the maternal surname before the paternal one instead. Edit 2. It wasn't $1,000. Different country, different currency. It's still a lot of money, but would probably translate to about $200 United States dollars. Relevant comments. Can you use Peter as a middle name? Our country culture doesn't generally use middle names. If we did, I'd be willing to think about that. Even though my son's name doesn't match Peter. How many Peters are alive right now in your family? There are 3 living Peters in the family right now. Only the eldest, my fiancé's great uncle, actually goes by Peter. The other 2 have nicknames. Pete, Petty, etc. Quote. OOP is voted NTA. Update post. May 24, 2023. A bit over 1 month later, OOP's post was removed from AITA and reposted on her profile. I'm using the date of the AITA post. Comments are also from AITA. I posted this on AITA, but it got removed about an hour ago because I mentioned a violent encounter on an edit. I tried editing it out and getting it back up, but it didn't work. I'm posting here in case anyone still wants to read it. Original. Thank you so much to everyone who commented and offered support. A lot has happened since I posted, so I thought I'd give you an update. About a week after my post, my fiancé's parents contacted us. They apologized for their behavior and begged to meet my son. They said they were ready to leave the naming debacle behind and truly wanted to be involved in their grandson's life. We were skeptical, but invited them over to meet the baby. The visit went well. They began coming over almost every day during the next 3 weeks. I noticed neither of them ever called my son by his name. But I didn't point it out. For the first time in months, things seemed good between my fiancé and his parents. One day, my fiancé was helping my Phil with something at our place. So my Mill and I went to the park with my baby. Sometime later, I had to go to the bathroom, so I left him in the stroller with her. When I got back, she was sitting on a park bench, chatting with a woman who was cooing over my son. I went over there and introduced myself as son's name, mom, and she said, I thought his name was Peter. I didn't say a word, and neither did my Mill. She followed me to the car and we went back to my apartment. On the way there, I texted my fiancé about what had happened. The moment we got there, he kicked both his parents out of our place. He'd read my texts and confronted his father. Thankfully, my Phil is a terrible liar, and confessed immediately. Apparently, both my in-laws only call my son Peter. That includes whenever they're talking about him. Every time they introduce him to someone else. And even baby talking to him on the few occasions they were left alone with him. Neither of them are embarrassed by this. And they both think they're in the right. We're heartbroken, especially my fiancé. Not only because his parents can't let go of their pride, but also because the name we chose for our son means a lot to us both. I blame myself for encouraging my fiancé to allow them near our son. I was raised in a different city than all my grandparents, and always wished they could have been more involved in my life. Losing my grandmother didn't help. Pretty much every doubt I had only existed because I thought it would be important for my son to grow up with all of his grandparents around. But now, all my guilt is gone. If they can't respect my son enough to call him by his name, they don't deserve to be in his life. I hope they enjoyed the 3 weeks they had with their grandson. Because that's all they're getting until they get their heads out of their asses. Edit. I thought I'd clarify some things. First of all, I'm not comfortable sharing my son's name here, but I promise it's not a Yowanik name or anything like that. It's perfectly normal and popularish in our country. Secondly, I mentioned this in the comments, but while my family didn't try to dictate me on my son's name, they would never be comfortable with it. My uncle Peter passed almost 3 decades ago, but it forever changed everyone who knew him. My grandmother's wish might seem a bit irrational, but it was motivated entirely by grief, and it didn't seem right to disrespect that just because she's not around anymore. And to whoever PM'd me that my fiancé's only on my side to keep the peace. He didn't want to use the name either. Months before I got pregnant, he told me he hoped one of his cousins would have a son before we did. Because he always hated the tradition and sympathized with my family. He's just as angry at his parents as I am, if not more. Also, most of his cousins and some other relatives have come around and apologized. Relevant comments. Are they this unhinged in other areas of your life too? According to my fiancé, they've always been a little entitled. But I never really saw them enough to be able to say that. I will say that, though they were polite, they very clearly didn't care about me until we moved in together. My Mill pretended not to remember my name every time she saw me. And my Phil would lose interest in any conversations that weren't about him. Once it was clear me and my fiancé were in for long term. They started acting a lot more friendly towards me. But it never seemed sincere. Have other family members come around yet? Most of my fiancé's cousins have come around. And his brother was always on our side. His grandmother and some of his aunts and uncles are with us too. His grandfather divorced from his grandmother. 2 out of 3 living Peters. The 2 oldest. And pretty much everyone else are either still mad at us or haven't reached out to talk about it yet. My entire family is on my side. They promised not to interfere in the naming process, but are relieved we didn't name him Peter. One more note on the $1,000 offered in the first post. And that's $1,000 in my country's currency. It roughly translates to $200 USD. Note Oop clarifies in a comment that she is Brazilian. Oop drops this horrible bombshell about her uncle. The one who died before she was born. My uncle was murdered. My grandmother's request was motivated by trauma. Again, my family would be mostly fine with naming my son Peter. My dad and my aunt might have been uncomfortable. And my grandmother asked us all not to do so. But I wouldn't have been disowned if I had. It simply felt disrespectful, especially since my grandmother passed shortly before my son was born. My uncle's death was traumatic for my family, but the name Peter is hugely common in my country. Tradition is fine and all, but those are some severely disturbed in-laws to take it to this level. They said our decision was selfish, and that my family should have moved on by now. They should take their own damn advice after 7 generations of using the same name. Some of them hadn't previously wanted to name their sons Peter, but did it anyway for the family's sake. It was their fault for giving in to pressure and not standing up for what they wanted. Now they want Oop to suffer too? Shameful. Such a precious thing to have a grandchild. Imagine throwing away any chance of a relationship with your grandson, any future grandchildren and your own son because you're hung up on a family tradition. Not to mention, one that started long before any of them were born and has no real importance to any of the living family. People be cray. On a side note, I hope they enjoyed the 3 weeks they had with their grandson. Because that's all they're getting until they get their heads out of their asses. Oop is a badass and I'm glad her fiancé and her are on the same page. Keep shining up those spines. Baby not Peter is going to be way better off without that set of grandparents. We broke a 10-generation tradition to name the firstborn boy John. My husband always hated sharing his name, and neither of us wanted to continue it with our son. They were pissed but seemed to get over it. We cut them off for other reasons, though. Racism, homophobia, etc. I'm so relieved that my son doesn't share a name with them. Guess that relationship really expressionless pinching hand sunglasses cool. Petered out. Tradition is peer pressure from dead people. These parents are unhinged so much the door fell off. Mom is right. I hope they enjoyed those 3 weeks because they may be the last. My father was adopted to carry on 400 years of John. He had 2 daughters. His parents wanted him to keep having kids until he had a son to carry on the family name. He refused. My sister is Joanne. My name doesn't start with a J. Oop is much nicer than me. I would have left Mill in the park. Can't be arsed to use my son's actual name? Walk your happy ass home. Quote, but I suspect that's because I am the asshole. This family that can't accept their grandchild is not a Peter got issues. Because of the heads up murder and how soon after OOP's grandmother's death the in-laws assumed the baby would be named Peter. I expected to read that the in-laws murdered Granny to remove what they saw as the obstacle to their tradition. I am still not convinced they didn't. I'm sorry. Who carried the baby for 9 months? Who's committed to raising this child until adulthood? Providing daily needs, education, shelter, food, clothing, nurturing? Nobody but the parent should have a say in naming the baby. Family is important, but this is not how family behaves around welcoming a new member. Way to ruin a beautiful time in everyone's lives with your entitlement. Just wow. As someone who dared be born a girl, breaking the 9-generation chain of firstborns being sons called Andrew, I thoroughly applaud this couple. Families can get crazy over traditions like this. And in so happy her husband supported her. And yes, my father's second child was a son. So now I somehow never existed to those grandparents. Lol. What a bunch of absolute nutters. Sure, it's a harmless enough, even sweet, tradition, but it's not more important than loved ones and their choice as, you know, parents. And then they done went into psycho territory FFS. Since it's in Brazil, I suspect that it's the Brazilian form Pedro, which is definitely a common name there. However, the family seems unhinged, wanting to force a tradition onto the parents. I'm still so pissed off the grandparents were calling the baby Peter to his face. If they'd managed to continue that until he was older, they could have seriously confused the poor kid's sense of self. My family should have moved on by now. They've had at least a century of Peters at this point. They should have moved on by now. It's still a lot of money, but would probably translate to about $200 United States dollars. I'd love to know how much this could buy them where they live. My morals can be bought, but I'd need something along the lines of enough for a down payment on a house. I live in the Bay Area. Lol. Neither of my fiancé's parents have met the baby. I personally would have been pleased. Only people who lost here was the grandparents. I love the commenter telling Oop that her husband is only agreeing to keep the peace. And what's wrong with that? What's wrong with agreeing with your spouse and the parent of your child to keep your family together and happy? It doesn't sound like that's what happened anyway. But let's pretend it did. That he agreed to not name his child Peter because he wanted his wife and her family to be comfortable with that decision? That's a good thing. That's the sign of a good partner. Her husband was willing to not keep the peace with his own family and keep the peace with his wife. And her family, and the commenter thinks that's a bad thing? That's weird.
If you enjoyed this video, please check out our playlists full of similar content. Epicaricast is like doom scrolling for your ears. Please like, share, and subscribe.